So, when you think of dive bombers, generally one of three planes comes to mind. All of these planes are from World War II, and all of them played a very effective role in doing exactly what they were designed to do. These three aircraft are, of course, the Ju-87 Stuka, flown by the German Army during World War II, the Aichi D-3A, codenamed Val by the American soldiers, flown by the Japanese Army, and of course the Allies' own SBD Dauntless, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The SBD, named as such based on the designation Scout Bomber Douglass, was the United States Navy's main carrier-based scout or dive bomber from mid-1940 through mid-1944. The SBD also earned a couple of other nicknames. During the period of time where it was being used around the Battle of Midway in June 1942, it earned the name Slow But Deadly, another play on the SBD initials. Now, the slow part of that, obviously, is attributed to the fact that it was an early war plane developed using a 1,000 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine, which, as cool as 1,000 horsepower is in a car, in an airplane of that size, you're not going to see quite the same performance as you would expect from 1,000 horsepower. However, it was still a very effective plane. It was very good at long-range missions. So good, in fact, that the plane that went on to replace it, the SB-2C Helldiver, was involved in a mission that involved 26 SBDs and 215 aircraft in total. Only 115 of those 215 made it back, 20 were lost to enemy action, and 80 were lost one by one as they expended their fuel on their way back and had to ditch into the sea. In this attack, all 26 SBDs made it back to the carrier. It had good handling characteristics, and it could carry a decent-sized load, accompanied, of course, by its, well, iconic ability to dive. This ability to dive was mostly brought on by the perforated dive brakes that were mounted in the rear portion of the main wings. Now, these perforated dive brakes are specifically interesting because it's basically what you would look at as far as a flap on a regular aircraft, except that it goes both up and down, and when in air brake position, extends much farther than it would in a flat position. This allowed the aircraft to keep itself from diving to speeds where the airframe would have issues handling the airspeed, and would allow the pilot to line up his target so that he could release the bomb accurately and hit what he was aiming for more often. All in all, 5,936 of this legendary plane were made. Now, the SBD-5, which is the fifth variant of this, in case that number was in any way confusing to anybody, was equipped with a 1,200 horsepower engine and an increased ammunition supply. This did lead to it being a slightly more effective plane, but that SBD-5 still was not enough to keep it from being relegated to a non-combat role later in the war. But before we get to the late war, let's talk about the early war. Oh, not just any early war, the beginning of the war as far as the United States was concerned. See, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Everybody knows this story, or at least I hope you do. I'm sure I'll go over that in a future video, but as of right now, we're going over the Dauntless. So, several Dauntlesses were launched from aircraft carriers during Pearl Harbor. Most of them ended up being destroyed on the decks of their aircraft carriers before being able to actually join the combat, though. However, on December 10th, a certain Japanese submarine designated I-70 was patrolling south of Oahu as a part of another group of submarines during Pearl Harbor. On December 9th, 1941, I-70 reported that she was 4 nautical miles southwest of Diamond Head and had sighted the United States Navy aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Shortly after this, I-70 attempted to intercept the Enterprise. Enterprise, of course, had a bunch of SBD-2s on deck. These SBD-2s would take off, and at some point during this day of December 10th, an SBD-2 Dauntless dive bomber of the U.S. Navy Scouting Squadron 6 sighted I-70 on the surface 121 miles northeast of Cape Halawa on the eastern end of Molokai and attacked with a single 1,000-pound bomb, scoring a near miss that inflicted damage on I-70 that prevented her from diving. Later on in the afternoon, another SBD from the same squadron sighted I-70 on the surface in the same area. Dive bomber, of course, had to climb so that it could dive, but once it had climbed up to that height, I-70 began a slow starboard turn and opened fire on the Dauntless. The Dauntless pilot did incorrectly report that the submarine was firing with 2 deck guns, even though I-70 only had 1. But either way, the Dauntless pilot dove and landed another bomb alongside I-70 amidships and blew several of her crew overboard with the blast from that bomb. I-70 went dead in the water and sank 45 seconds after the bomb exploded. Now, that made the SBD Dauntless responsible for sinking the first Japanese submarine of World War II. Jumping ahead just a little bit to June 4 through 7 of 1942, the SBD Dauntless was involved in the Battle of Midway. This battle, of course, was a very bloody battle as far as casualties on both sides were concerned. Although, it is notable that the Japanese lost over 3,000 while the Americans lost less than 400 lives during this fight. But still, several TBD devastators. Several is a very light way of putting it. 3 entire squadrons of devastators failed to take down any of the Japanese fleet during this time, which now that's not entirely the aircraft's fault or the crew's fault. It was a very uncoordinated early attack. But these early attacks then led to SBDs coming in, landing precise bombs, very large falling shot, I guess. It landed several precise bombs on these aircraft carriers and sunk 4 of them. Now, unfortunately, in the middle months of 1943, about a year after the Battle of Midway, the bomber was considered by many of its pilots to be too vulnerable for service because its armament and its slow speed made it a much easier target for the newer generation of enemy fighters that it was going up against, and therefore it was taken out of combat roles and relegated to the back line. So yeah, it's a very cool plane. It's got a very solid place in history, and we would all be good to remember things that have solid places in history. So, thank you for joining me as we take a little tour of the history of this wonderful little aircraft. That's Demonic Maelstrom signing off.